Good evening, welcome to Weather God's Wisdom. Today we'll be discussing Tropical Storm Cristobal here. As always, these thoughts are mine alone, and making decisions regarding Cristobal, please refer to the National Hurricane Center and your local National Weather Service office for the latest regarding the system. Okay, let's get into this. Cristobal today has strengthened a little and is beginning to organize its inner core here. It has tightened up pretty considerably since this morning. The tilt of the storm is, or the stretching of the inner core, I guess, is much less than it was this morning. You had wind maximums way out here to the northeast of the system, and that is gone now. You have a very tight core, and you can see that on the latest recon here. You have winds now approaching 50 knots here at flight level, or actually at 50 knots here at flight level, and a much lower pressure than it was this morning. And core is beginning to develop here. We do have something that is trying to form here. It's not super well defined yet, but it could continue this kind of upward trend here and intensify a little bit more before it potentially interacts with, the Yucatan Peninsula here. And this has already dumped a ton of rain over Mexico here as a flooding disaster in this area. So we really don't need this system to intensify anymore. It would be very nice if it could just move out, but that is not the case. So today we'll be looking at models. You can see this is the current ECMWF. This is the European model depicting that kind of tilted vorticity here that is beginning to kind of close off and not be as tilted. And you can see in 24 hours, they bring the system ashore. And what we will be watching is how far ashore this comes before it moves to the north. If it comes a little further in here, then it will be much more broad, which is depicted by the GFS model. You have the GFS brings this ashore pretty far inland, and you see that this gyre of that Cristobal is embedded in is much more potent, and ultimately the system kind of just dissolves, and is not, the vorticity is not as strong as the ECMWF, which carries this less inland and still has a pretty strong vorticity in here. One of the things that is to note about the current positioning of Cristobal, it is a little bit north of where it is supposed to be right now, so that could have implications on how far inland the system goes, if it does indeed go inland, and that would have major implications on the strength down the road. What the ECMWF wants is the system kind of briefly touches southern Mexico and then comes back over the Bay of Campeche and then moves away from Mexico and begins to move towards the central Gulf Coast here, which does need to bear watch over this system over the next few days. And the GFS has a much more elongated system here, and you're watching the evolution of the upper level steering in here that is occurring, because we have, if we go back to the water vapor loop here, you have this trough that is ejecting to the northeast, and as this trough begins to erode the ridge out to the west or to the east, then the storm will start to feel the tug of the trough and try to go towards the weakness here that is between the ridge that is developing over Mexico and strengthening, which could push it a little bit to the west. Though in earlier model solutions, that was what it looked like, and it's still kind of evident, but it's not super clear. And as the system continues to kind of meander here, this trough will erode this ridge, and this storm will be moving north. Depending on how fast that occurs will ultimately determine the path of the system. You see here that the ridge is almost completely eroded by this time, 4 days out, around 7 a.m. Saturday. And so the system is moving a little faster, and you see this trough is still here on the GFS model. And if you look at the 200 millibar wind here, you see that it is being pulled pretty quickly you see this trough right here, is pulling this storm pretty quickly to the north. And if we go back to the 500 millibar height anomaly, you can see that this ridge kind of fails to build in north of it. And we have the European model, which depicts a very different situation. This ridge is still here, which would keep it south a little longer. And this ridge is much stronger, and there's much less presence of a trough here than the GFS model. So what this means is it could determine the forward motion of this system and allow these steering currents to kind of get in place here. And you have the ridge now is to the direct north of the system, and you have this ridge is eroded a little bit because of the trough that is over the mid-Atlantic now. And what ultimately happens is this ridge, it kind of works its way around this ridge, as this ridge is going to try to work with this trough and move with this trough. And this is a very sticky situation. There's a lot of kinks that need to be worked out in this forecast. This is 6 days away here. So, and what is being forecast by the GFS and the European model is roughly similar, but there are a lot of intensity kinks that need to be worked out here. How deep inland the storm gets will ultimately determine how intense this storm is once it gets to the central Gulf of Mexico here, and where it is in the central Gulf of Mexico here, because you have the European model here that has it a little further south and is a little further west than the GFS model here, because the GFS model has it a little further to the east. And so that all this is very everything is very fluid right now, and as the system continues to kind of meander here in the southern Gulf of Mexico, we will watch for how the system is affected by its interaction with the Yucatan Peninsula, and if it does even interact as much as it is expected to. The general consensus right now is that it does briefly come ashore, and it does come ashore at some point, and we will be watching when that happens. But regardless, right now, if you're in Mexico, this is a very significant rain event here and a pretty horrible problem. The flooding is really bad here. This rain has been going on for multiple days and looks to be continuing as the system kind of just sits here. And as for the central Gulf Coast, you will have something that is coming up here, and the intensity has yet to be really figured out. This is still a pretty long way forecast. It's at least 4 days out, and a lot can change in this time. It could be stronger at this time, or it could be weaker at this time. And ultimately, what happens down here will determine what happens to the central Gulf Coast and who exactly does get impacted with this system eventually. So we'll continue to watch Cristobal here. Very interesting situation. Pretty complex situation for this time of year. It is only June 2nd, and we already are on our third system here. And so, very busy tropics here today. So, that's all I have to say. As always, stay safe and stay tuned to the weather.